In the autumn of 1881, in the flint-hard country north of the Cimarron Breaks, a man named Eli Marrow counted $20 into the palm of a land agent and bought a hole in the ground that the whole town of Hollow Bend had already agreed was worthless. It had been the Tanner Root cellar once, dug into the shoulder of a low rise behind what used to be the Tanner Spread, before fever took the family and left the property to the bank and the bank left it to the weeds. The roof beam had rotted through in the middle. The stone facing had slumped on the north wall like a tired old horse leaning into its harness. Rainwater pooled at the threshold in a black, mosquito-fat puddle that never fully dried, even in July. Men in Hollow Bend called it the grave, not unkindly, just factually, the way they'd call a broken wagon a wheel that don't roll. Eli Marrow had exactly $20 left in the world, the sum total of what remained after his own farm had gone under the previous spring, drought first, then the bank, then the quiet auction where his neighbors bought his plow and his good mule and would not meet his eyes while doing it. He had a wagon, a graying dog named Tick, a horse called Beryl who was getting old but hadn't yet said so, and his grandfather's leather notebook, its pages gone soft and brown at the corners from 40 years of handling. Everyone assumed he'd use his last money on seed, or a room at the boarding house, or a train ticket east to wherever men went when the frontier finished with them. Instead, he bought the grave. Word got around fast, the way it does in a town of 400 souls with nothing better to gossip about. By the second week of October, Eli found himself standing before the Hollow Bend Grange Committee, 6 men and 1 long table, asking for a formal trial. He proposed to rebuild the Tanner Cellar as a common storehouse for the town's shared grain surplus that winter, a place where the co-op's wheat and the widow Vance's preserves and whatever the Grange couldn't fit in its own crib could sit at a steady 38 degrees straight through to March, safe from freeze and rot both. In exchange, he asked only a modest storage fee, paid after the fact, once the grain came out sound in spring. Alderman Josiah Pruitt, who ran the general store and held the paper on half the farms in the valley, laughed before Eli had finished his second sentence. You want to put 600 bushels of good Hollow Bend wheat into a hole that's already killed one family's fortune, he said, and you want us to pay you for the privilege of watching it rot. The room laughed with him. But laughter costs a town nothing, and men who might otherwise have shrugged Eli off instead grew curious, the way a crowd grows curious before a hanging. Pruitt, sensing an audience, proposed a public trial. A single-day's storage, this Saturday, 300 bushels of the co-op's newest wheat brought down and sealed in the rebuilt cellar overnight, opened again Sunday morning before the whole congregation on their way out of church. If the grain came out dry and cool, the co-op would sign a season's contract at Eli's price. If not, Eli would owe the co-op for whatever spoiled, and the matter would never be raised again. Eli agreed before he'd thought it through. He had 4 days to make a grave hold 600 pounds of trust. He worked without sleep, without help beyond Tick pacing the lip of the cellar and Beryl hauling stone from the creek bed. He shored the rotted beam with green cottonwood, packed the north wall with fresh clay, laid a floor of crushed limestone over hard-packed earth, and roofed the whole structure with sod cut into 18-inch squares, 3 layers deep, the way, he believed, his grandfather had once described. He did not consult the notebook. He told himself he remembered well enough. He was wrong. Saturday night, under a clear cold sky, the co-op's wheat went down into the cellar in burlap sacks, 300 bushels of the valley's best crop, watched by lantern light by half the Grange committee and Pruitt himself, arms folded, saying nothing, which was somehow worse than his laughter. Sunday, an hour before church let out, the temperature dropped 9 degrees inside of 90 minutes, and a wind came down off the breaks carrying the season's first real snow, wet and heavy, 6 inches by the time the congregation filed out to watch the cellar opened. The sod roof, still green, still unsettled on its cottonwood beam, had absorbed the wet snow like a sponge absorbing water. The added weight found the one joint Eli hadn't properly seated. At 9:40 that morning, in front of nearly the whole town of Hollow Bend, the center of the roof groaned once, a low, animal sound, and folded inward. Grain dust and clay and broken sod rained down into the sacks below. 3 men had to pull Eli back by the collar before the second beam went. When the dust settled, Perhaps 40 bushels were crushed outright, and the rest were soaked through with meltwater and grave dirt, ruined for eating, fit only for hogs. Pruitt did not gloat. He simply turned to the crowd and said, loud enough for everyone, "That's the last of Merrow's grave business." Then, and the words traveled through Hollow Bend faster than the snow had. The co-op billed him for the spoiled wheat, a debt of $11 he did not have. The Grange withdrew its offer entirely and posted, at Pruitt's urging, a formal notice at the church door warning residents against entrusting goods to unlicensed storage, a notice that named the Tanner property by location, if not by name. And that evening, at the Callaway house, where Eli had for 8 months been calling on the eldest daughter, Sarah, with her father's cautious blessing, Ezra Callaway met him at the porch step rather than the door, and told him, not unkindly, but with a finality that closed like a gate, that the matter of Eli calling on Sarah was, for now, best left alone. Eli walked back to the ruined cellar in the dark with Tick at his heel and stood a long while at the collapsed threshold, looking down into what the town now, without exception, called the grave. He had not thought to ask, in the rush of those 4 days, how the Tanner cellar had come to be sold so cheap in the first place, though the answer had been sitting in plain sight the whole time. Old Tanner himself, 20 years back, had dug it in half a season, alone, working from instinct rather than method, and it had failed him the same way. A shallow footing, no proper drainage channel below the frost line, walls that heaved with every freeze and settled with every thaw until the whole structure gave up trying to hold its shape. Tanner had cursed the ground and moved his family's stores to a leaky shed instead, and the cellar had simply been left to rot, a monument to one man's impatience passed down, unlearned from, to another. That night Eli went looking for his grandfather's notebook, not to plan, only for something of his grandfather's to hold. He found it at the bottom of his trunk, and when he opened it by lamplight, his hands unsteady, he found what he had skipped past twice already in his hurry. A full page, dated 1849, headed simply Root Cellars, Frost Country, in his grandfather's small, careful hand. Dig below the frost line, not to it. In this country, for feet minimum, 5 is safer. Footing stone must rest on gravel, never bare clay, or the freeze will heave it inch by inch each winter until the whole wall walks itself apart. Roof loads must be carried on seasoned timber, cured 2 years, never green. Greenwood settles under snow load precisely when you need it most to hold. Sod roofing wants at minimum 1 full season to root and bind before it can be trusted to bear weight. Ventilation matters as much as insulation. A sealed cellar sweats and rots its contents as surely as an open one freezes them. Every line was an accusation. Every line was also, Eli understood slowly, sitting there with the notebook open on his knee and Tick's chin resting heavy on his boot, a second chance he had not earned but had been given anyway, in his grandfather's hand, 20 years before he'd need it. He told no one what he intended to do next. He could not have afforded to, even if pride had allowed it. Through the last weeks of October and into a gray, close November, Eli worked the ruined cellar alone, mostly at dusk and before dawn, when Hollow Bend's main street was empty enough that a man could come and go without being seen doing whatever it was he was still doing at the grave. He redug the footing by hand, 4.5 feet down, striking gravel at last, and setting stone atop it rather than the raw clay that had doomed both Tanner's effort and his own. He cut a drainage channel along the low side of the slope, lined it with fist-sized creek stone, so meltwater would have somewhere to go besides straight through his walls. He salvaged what seasoned timber he could find, an old barn beam from a farm abandoned 2 winters back, dried gray and hard as iron, rather than trust Greenwood again. He did not roof it with sod this time. He waited. His ledger from those weeks, kept in the back pages of his grandfather's notebook in his own smaller, harder hand, ran short and grim. November 3rd, footing set, 4 feet 6 inches, gravel bed 6 inches. November 9th, drainage channel complete, 40 feet. November 14th, beam salvaged, seasoned approximate 3 years, sound. November 21st, walls dry stacked, north face true. November 27th, money remaining, none. Sold Barrel's old saddle to Whitfield for feed. It was the only entry in 6 weeks that admitted anything close to what the work was costing him. His sister, Ruth, who kept house for him since their mother's passing and had followed him from the failed farm to town with nowhere else to go, watched the weeks pass with a tightening patience that Eli, absorbed in stone and gravel, was slow to notice. She had taken in mending to keep food on their table, while Eli poured every spare hour into a hole in the ground the entire town had already buried once. In the last week of November, with the mending money thin and the woodpile thinner, she found him at the cellar past dark, laying the last course of the drainage stone by lantern light, and she did not raise her voice, which was somehow worse than if she had. "I have stood by you through the farm and through the auction and through Sarah Calloway's father closing his door on you," she said, "and I will not stand by and watch you bury us both in Josiah Pruitt's grave a second time. I have a standing offer from our cousin in Emporia. Steady work, a roof that doesn't need rebuilding. I mean to write her by week's end and go, Eli, unless you can give me some reason tonight not to." Eli did not argue the point. He had no words ready that would have served, and he understood, standing there with stone dust on his hands, that words had already failed him once in front of the whole town. Instead, he set down his lantern, walked to where Ruth stood at the cellar's mouth, and led her by the elbow down the new stone steps into the finished chamber, dry-walled, gravel-footed, ventilated through a stovepipe vent he'd cut into the hillside above, and showed her, without a word, the small store he'd already laid in against the coming winter on his own account. A dozen jars of the Widow Vance's preserves, entrusted to him quietly 2 weeks before, sitting cool and untouched on a shelf. Of salvaged plank, dry as the day they'd gone in. Ruth looked at the jars a long moment, then at her brother's hands, cracked and stone-scarred, then said only, "Show me the ledger," and did not write to Emporia that week or the next. The widow Agatha Vance had been the one person in Hollow Bend who never signed her name to Pruitt's warning notice at the church door. She had lost her own husband to a bad winter 11 years back and had little patience left for a town's collective memory being shorter than its collective mockery. When Eli came to her door in early November, ashamed, asking only if she might trust a dozen jars of her chokecherry preserves to a hole in the ground that had just publicly ruined 300 bushels of the town's wheat, she had looked at him a long moment and said, "Tanner never dug deep enough, and everybody in this town knew it and let him do it anyway. You dig deep enough this time, Eli Marrow, and I'll trust you with more than jars." She had said it plainly, without warmth, the way a woman states a fact rather than offers comfort, and it had been, in 6 weeks of silence and mockery, the only vote of confidence Eli received. By the second week of December, the rebuilt cellar held Agatha's dozen jars, 40 pounds of Eli's own dried corn, and, the true, quiet test, 60 pounds of the co-op's spoiled wheat he'd bought back from the hog feed price at his own cost, determined to prove even the ruined lesson could be redeemed. Through a hard cold snap that dropped the outside air to 11 degrees and held it there 4 straight days, the cellar's interior, checked morning and night by Eli's own crude spirit thermometer, never wavered more than 3 degrees from 39. No one saw this but Eli, Ruth, and, on the 4th morning, Agatha Vance herself, who came to check on her jars and stayed to watch the little thermometer with an expression Eli had not seen on anyone in Hollow Bend in 2 months, something close to respect. It was Agatha, in fact, who first noticed what was coming. She had kept sheep on the open range long enough to read a sky the way other people read a newspaper, and on the 18th of December, she stopped Eli on the street to tell him, without preamble, that the geese had gone quiet 3 days running, that her rooster had taken to roosting inside the shed instead of atop it, and that her bones, which had never once lied to her about weather in 40 years on the plains, told her Hollow Bend had a bad blizzard coming inside the week, worse than the one that had taken her husband. Eli's own dog, Tick, had been pacing the cellar's mouth for 2 days by then, refusing to settle, and Beryl had grown skittish in his stall in a way the old horse hadn't shown in years, ears pinned flat at nothing at all. Eli wrote it in the ledger that night, December 18th. A. Vance predicts storm within week. Animals restless. Barometer, if I had one, would likely agree. Storehouse ready as it will ever be. No one else in Hollow Bend prepared. Pruitt's General Store kept its usual hours. The Grange Committee met Thursday as scheduled and did not raise the matter. The town, having buried Eli's cellar once in its collective judgment, saw no reason to dig up the question of whether it might now be sound. The blizzard came on the 22nd of December, 2 days ahead of even Agatha's reckoning, arriving not as a gathering storm, but as a wall, the temperature falling 18 degrees in under an hour, the wind rising to a scream, snow driving sideways so thick a man could lose the church steeple at 40 paces. It held Hollow Bend for 3 days and 2 nights, burying the valley under drifts that in places stood taller than a man on horseback. The town's main grain crib, the Grange's own storehouse, built solid and respected and never once doubted by anyone, had its roof cave under snow load on the second night, the same failure Eli's cellar had suffered in miniature 2 months before, only now on a scale that threatened the whole valley's seed grain for the coming spring, and with it, half of Hollow Bend's ability to plant at all come April. Worse, 3 families caught out checking stock when the storm broke first, among them Josiah Pruitt himself, gone to see to his own cattle when the sky still looked merely ugly rather than deadly, found themselves unable to make it back to Main Street through drifts that had closed the road entire. Pruitt and 2 of his hired men took shelter where they could find it, which turned out to be the low rise behind the old Tanner spread, within sight of a cellar door that, unlike every other structure on that hillside, was not buried, was not caved in, and showed, faint under the driving snow, a thread of warmer air rising visibly from its stovepipe vent. Eli heard the pounding on the cellar door through the scream of the wind, and for 1 full second did not move. It was not fear of the storm that froze him. It was the memory of the last time this cellar had opened before witnesses, the groan of green timber, the rain of dust and ruined grain, Pruitt's voice carrying over the crowd. His hand went first, wrongly, to seal the vent tighter rather than open the door, some old instinct telling him to protect the chamber's warmth from the intrusion of the storm rather than let 3 freezing men in through it. He caught the mistake almost as soon as he'd made it, felt the wrongness of it in his own hands the way his grandfather's notebook had once corrected him from the grave, and instead threw the bar and hauled the door wide against the wind's full weight, letting Pruitt and his 2 men stumble down the stone steps he himself had set 4.5 feet into gravel 2 months before. Inside, by lantern light, in air that held steady at 39 degrees while the world outside had fallen past zero, Eli worked without speaking much, packing the newcomers in wool from his own stores, checking Pruitt's hands and face for the white, waxy signs of frostbite, finding none too severe, feeding the small store's dried corn into a low fire vented properly up through the stovepipe his grandfather's notebook had insisted on. Ruth arrived an hour later, having tracked her brother's lantern glow from their own place through drifts to her knees, and did not ask questions, only set to work beside him. By the second night, word had reached the rest of the stranded valley through the one path still passable, the low ground behind the Tanner rise, and what had been a grave in October became, without ceremony or announcement, the only warm, dry shelter for 6 families and 11 head of stock through the worst of the storm, its ventilation holding the air breathable, its deep-set walls never once heaving, its seasoned roof beam carrying 3 feet of snow load without a groan. Josiah Pruitt sat through the second night of the blizzard on an overturned grain sack in a cellar he had once called a grave, warmed by a fire tended by the man he had ruined in front of the whole town, and said nothing at all about it, not that night nor the next morning when the wind finally broke. He watched Eli check the little spirit thermometer by lantern light, watched him note the reading in a small brown ledger without comment, and when the storm cleared enough on the 3rd morning for the stranded families to begin filing back down toward Main Street, Pruitt was the last to leave. At the cellar door, he paused, looked back once at the dry-stacked walls and the gravel footing visible where the stone had been laid bare by traffic, and reached out to grip Eli's shoulder, once, briefly, the way a man grips the shoulder of someone he has no intention of thanking aloud. Then he went home and never spoke of the grave again, in mockery or otherwise, for as long as he lived in Hollow Bend. There was no gathering in the square, no speech, no formal reversal of the Grange's notice, which in fact stayed nailed to the church door another 2 weeks before someone quietly took it down. The town's relief, when it came, was practical rather than public. Men began, without much comment, referring to the rise behind the old Tanner place as Merrow's cellar instead of the grave, and by spring the co-op's committee sent word, through no one grander than a boy with a note, that they'd welcome Eli's storage terms for the coming harvest if he'd still have them. Eli read the note once, folded it into the back of his grandfather's ledger, and did not go looking for anyone to tell. What sat with him longest, in the days after the storm, was not the town's slow thaw toward him, but a smaller, private thing that had nothing to do with Hollow Bend at all. Standing alone at the cellar's mouth on the morning the snow finally stopped, watching sunlight strike the packed drift where 3 days before Josiah Pruitt had pounded on his door in terror, and feeling, for the first time since the collapse in October, that the ground beneath his feet had finally, fully, stopped shifting. Ruth found him there and said nothing either, only stood beside him a while, and then reached over and brushed a fleck of frozen sod from his shoulder, the same shoulder Pruitt had gripped 2 mornings before, an old habit of hers from when they were children and their mother still lived, and Eli let her, and neither of them spoke of Emporia again. Tick lay curled at the cellar's threshold in a patch of returning sun, no longer pacing, no longer restless, and Beryl, in his stall down the rise, had gone quiet too, ears forward, the storm's memory already fading from an animal's short accounting of the world. Agatha Vance came by that afternoon for her jars, found them exactly as she'd left them, dry and cool and whole, and told Eli only that she'd expected as much, which from her was as near to praise as the valley would ever hear her give. The Tanner cellar stood another 40 years on that low rise north of the Cimarron Breaks, rebuilt twice more as timber aged and settled, but never again failed a Hollow Bend winter, and the notebook that had saved it, Eli's grandfather's small brown ledger with its own harder hand added beneath, passed eventually to Ruth's own children, who kept it not for the technique alone, dig below the frost line, not to it, but for the one line Eli himself had added at the very bottom of the last used page, dated the morning after the storm broke. A man is not finished by the roof that falls on him in October. He is finished only if he stops digging.